Startups often delay hiring a full-time CFO until they are more established. But what are you missing out on by scaling your business without a CFO? Well, in this episode, Aarish Shah, a serial entrepreneur and a fractional CFO, will share practical insights and strategies to help your startup's financial health. I was quite excited to kind of get this interview together with Aarish, as he's got quite a diverse background, from working in consultancy, running his family business, to now being the founder of Emerge One and Projected, and the host of two wonderful podcasts, Nothing Ventured and Off Balance. At Emerge One, a consultancy that provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed startups and scale-ups, Aarish and his team have collectively raised hundreds of millions in funding and helped ventures launch, scale, and exit. Yes, you are in good hands. Welcome to the Mary Poppins of Startups live show. I'm Nalima Kangu from Athena Leaders. As a tech consultant and startup advisor, I will answer live the burning questions that you have on your journey to Series A+. Subscribe and tune in every week for top tips to meet amazing guests, startup founders, investors, and more. More importantly, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Aarish, welcome to the show. So we've got quite a lot to get through today because, again, as I've tell people, and I'm not ashamed of that, I've done a lot of stalking to find out about your background, and there's so many interesting things that I want to cover. But first, for those who don't really know you, and especially Emerge One, do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction of what you do at Emerge One?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me on the podcast, on this live show, Nelly. Really excited to be here. Wow, where to begin? Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm the founder of Emerge One. So we're a consultancy that provides fractional CFO support to venture-backed tech startups and scale-ups. We have a number of companies within our portfolio. We're often referred in, or in fact, almost all of our businesses are referred in by VCs, the likes of Hoxton, Stride, Octopus, Playfair, Founders Factory, Outlier Ventures, and various others. And we typically work at kind of post-seed, post-revenue, pre-series B, and are often kind of the first senior finance hire, if I can put it that way, in a business. And essentially, we're there to support the growth of the business, providing kind of strategic finance advice, but also, getting our hands dirty, because ultimately startups are startups. There is a limited capital, and everyone has to kind of get both of their hands stuck right in. On top of Emerge One, as you kindly mentioned, I have a couple of podcasts. I have Nothing Ventured, which is a podcast that explores the venture ecosystem from the eyes of VCs, investors, angels, founders, and operators. And Off Balance, where I give sort of 1 to 2 minute short kind of snippets around essential kind of learnings that I've had from 2 decades of now operating and running businesses.
Yeah, and definitely I will suggest that people go and check out your podcasts. I've been listening to them, and they've been keeping me company on my travels. There's a lot of great insights there on both the podcasts that you're running. Now, one of the reasons why I was thinking about doing something with finance, although, I work a lot more on the technology side, is whilst talking to a bunch of startup founders, and we touched this idea of, being a CFO and what it was, as some people tend to narrow it down to accounting and making sure now the company runs well from that perspective. But I don't really appreciate the full spectrum of or how you can help them. So do you want to share a little bit more of what does a fractional CFO brings to a company, especially as they are scaling rapidly?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think first of all, it's kind of busting the myth of what a CFO does and is. And sadly, I all too often see in technology businesses and startups, people being brought in and given that CFO title, but haven't really had the experience to necessarily merit it. So the way I break it down is actually you have kind of 2 sides to your business from a finance perspective, and then that can be broken down even further. On the one hand, you have what I like to call finance ops or FinOps, finance operations, which is essentially the day-to-day, right? And you just mentioned it there. It's the bookkeeping, it's the processes, the controls, it's making the payments, it's managing suppliers, it's managing payroll. It's all of those sort of day-to-day nitty-gritty kind of things that need to be done in finance. And what I like to call kind of the basic hygiene layer of finance that you require in your business, right? And those are all roles that aren't what the CFO does. If your CFO is doing any of those roles, you've either hired the wrong person, or you haven't really thought through kind of how your finance stack needs to operate. And obviously today, a lot of those sort of tasks have been automated away, or at least semi-automated away. So you now have platforms like Xero, which allow even people without a solid knowledge of accounting to do their books. Although I have to admit, again, have seen lots of poor examples of where that's happened. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. Other platforms that allow you to manage your receipts and expenses in an automated way to make your payments. There are now sort of various other platforms, that are out there to help you with credit card management and so on and so forth. But what your CFO does, and fractional versus full time is a different kind of part of the story. But essentially, whether it's a fractional CFO or a full time CFO, they are doing the same thing, right? What a CFO is there to do is to help you manage capital at its very simplest, right? The job of the CFO is to make sure that you are managing and allocating your capital efficiently and strategically. And what does that mean in reality? So let's say you've just raised 3 or 4 million seed round. You now have a bunch of capital sitting on your balance sheet. You have a bunch of cash. You need to think about, well, how long is that going to last me in terms of runway? What are the key hires that I need to make? What are the right hires to make? Not even just the key ones. Should I be investing in engineering resource versus commercial versus operations? Should I be doing something different altogether? How do I think about compensating those people? What are the right levels of compensation? Should I be providing options to those people? How does that look? How does that affect my capital structure? Should I be looking at debt financing or revenue-based financing? Or indeed, should I actually not be thinking about fundraising at all in the current market? And therefore, what do I need to do to be able to manage my business effectively and efficiently as I scale? It's then things like, I'm now thinking about geographical expansion. How do I do that? How do I structure that? When is the right time to open that entity in the US or in Australia or Europe or Southeast Asia? What is the right time to think about putting in an EMI scheme? Or indeed, how do I think about R&D and thinking about claiming credits back from the government? So your CFO essentially is there to help you manage the flow of capital in and out of your business and to best utilize that capital. Really great CFOs have a very firm understanding of the numbers in terms of the accounting kind of side of things, but they are also firmly embedded in your KPIs and metrics, which may be non-financial, especially with many technology businesses, and understand and help you understand as a founder how you can use those numbers to best scale, and where you need to think about changing your business if those numbers aren't doing what you hope they would do. A lot of the role of the CFO, as I talk about it, is around narrative over the numbers. So it's taking the numbers and turning that data into information for the management, for the board, for investors, right? So they can understand how the business is performing and how to track the business and understand kind of how those indicators are driving the business forward. So, the role of the CFO is pretty complex. I always say it's not a role that you can qualify for. It's a role that you essentially earn through the experience of working and operating in a business over many, many years. There are all sorts of things I haven't touched on, things like M&A, so mergers and acquisitions, going out looking for businesses to acquire, or indeed even dressing your own business up for exit. These are all things that the CFO gets heavily involved in. But equally, no single business is the same. So every business that we work with, as an example, will have different requirements and different priorities. And the role of the CFO is often to kind of, really figure out how to understand what is a priority and what is urgent versus what is not a priority and not urgent at all.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. That was such a great detailed explanation there. And there's quite a lot that I would like to unpack based on what you just said. So the first thing, just going right back at the beginning when you mentioned a bit of a difference between a fractional CFO and a full-time CFO. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So look, so first of all, I guess a bit of an explanation as to what a fractional CFO is. So a fractional CFO is someone that works, I guess, on a part-time basis in your business. So that may be, a day across a week or 2 full days in a week, or it may be, on an ad hoc basis, depending on what your requirements are. And really, a fractional CFO does everything that a full-time CFO does. They just do it in less time. And why is that possible? It's often because you don't need at the very early stages, or even kind of as you're growing, the full-time support of a CFO, because there just simply isn't enough quote unquote work to be done. So if you think about the strategic kind of requirements of a business post the fundraise, it might be setting up reporting or forecasting. It might be getting that EMI scheme in place or claiming the R&D credits, or whatever those sort of things are. Those are relatively kind of small but extendable projects that can be done not on a full-time basis, because they don't require 7 hours a day in an office working on something specific. As you scale and you get to kind of Series B plus, you're now talking about raising tens of millions of dollars or pounds in capital, and you have a sufficient balance sheet that you actually probably do need someone full-time to help you manage that. You're starting to expand, as I said earlier, geographically. You're hiring more staff. You're moving from maybe 50, 75 people to 100, 150, maybe even 200 plus. And that just requires more time and more hands-on in the business sort of face time, I guess, for the CFO to be required on a full-time basis. So often what I say is, as I said earlier, if you're kind of post-seed but pre-Series B, fractional is almost certainly going to be sufficient enough. And post-Series B, even if you as a business don't necessarily have a full-time need for a CFO, your investors or your board are certainly going to ask you for one. And equally, what we're seeing today in 2023 versus, let's say, 2 years ago, is that boards and investors are also waking up to the fact, or not necessarily waking up to the fact, but revisiting the need for fractional CFO support or CFO support, even at the earlier stages, which, for a while, whilst discipline was kind of lost with startups and, crazy funding rounds happening on a regular basis, often without, that solid kind of finance support in the business. Those times are over. We're back to kind of fundamentals. Understanding your numbers, understanding how you're going to get to your milestones has now become critical. And therefore, at those earlier stages, having that fractional CFO in place is becoming, almost a must-have.
It's interesting you say that, because I've seen and heard many stories of startups that are starting really well. They get to a Series A round, raise a lot of money, but of course things slips. You had excitement of having all that money in the bank, and you want to offer more perks, right? Free lunches, free this, and all of that, without thinking about the implication and how everything comes together, and not just for now, but for the projection and the runway that you have as well. Now, that's also trigger another questions that I have, because CFOs, whether fractional or full-time, you tend to come in a little bit later when the leadership team has been working together for quite a while, whether we're talking about CTO, CPO, sometimes we already have a CEO, depending on the company or not. Then you have someone that comes in and says, "Oh, we want to do X, Y, Z." I'm like, if you looked at the the balance sheets, right? You become like the conscience of the company, not in a negative way, but to allow them to move further. But I believe that can sometimes cause conflict. I don't know if you have dealt with some of the situation before, and how do you navigate or support the leadership team, especially for a first-time founder going through that journey of growth, to understand what you're bringing and bringing back the team together?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, look, the CFO role is as much cultural and chemistry fit as it is a competency fit, right? So the expectation of a CFO is that, the base stakes, the table stakes, are that you understand numbers, you understand how to calculate LTV and CAC, and what ARR is and why that's important, and how you think about funding rounds and valuations. All of that stuff is kind of the basic must know stuff for a CFO. But actually the harder circle to square, or square to circle, is that cultural fit, right? So as you said, you're often coming in at a period or in a period where the company has already built up some form of culture. But the CFO's role is, yes, to act somewhat as a conscious, but also to be an enabler of growth, right? And it's to sort of hold a mirror up to the founder. So I often see my role as first gray hair in the business, right? I know it doesn't necessarily look like I have much, but there is definitely some creeping out. And what I bring to the table, or what CFOs tend to bring to the table, is their understanding of numbers, but also their understanding essentially of business, right? And how business works and what is best practice and how you can get the best out of your teams and people without having to just throw money at the problem, right? Because money isn't always the solution to a particular problem, right? So if you have a company with a poor culture, if you have like toxic employees in there, it doesn't matter how much money you throw at, your good staff. Like at some stage, they're going to get really upset about, this guy is always bad mouthing, or, is always rocking up to work late, or is just not a team player. Like they're just not going to stick around. And therefore the CFO is really there to sort of say, well, okay, how do we actually take the culture that you've built and grow that past just being a founder-led business? Because there is a really big difference between a startup and what we call in Europe a scale-up, right? So a startup, you are a small team. You're one of maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 15, right? And it's very easy to have the founder's culture permeate kind of that sort of a business. But as you start to grow, you can't rely on the founder's culture being the only culture, because you'll have subcultures grow within the business. You'll have teams and pockets and silos, and you'll have politics, and you'll have all sorts of other things. And therefore, if you're a CFO coming into a business at a later stage, you've got to figure out how you can fit in with the dominant culture, but also how you can ensure that the culture isn't a blocker to growth, because ultimately that's what it's about, right? Like if you are building a startup, especially if you're a venture-backed business, you're building that business to scale. If you're unable to scale, then by default, you are not a venture-backable business, right? And there are always going to be trade-offs between culture and scale, right? Not necessarily to the extent that you have to get rid of a company's early stage culture altogether, but there are always going to be tensions between those two things. You may be a business that doesn't care about your P&L, or a founder that doesn't care about looking at your P&L or your balance sheet on a regular basis, but your CFO will. And guess what? That's a good thing. And your CFO will tell you what's happening in your P&L and balance sheet, or in your revenue numbers, or in your KPIs, or in your metrics, to help you better lead the company forward. So it is about providing that information and that kind of discipline that helps companies grow rather than stops them from growing rather. And one of the things that I often see in businesses is this kind of crisis of control that founders have, where they don't want to give up things, right? They're often sort of reluctant to give up, I don't know, whatever, the bank account, or, signing off on payroll, or signing off on every kind of piece of expenditure that comes out. But actually, if you've got a really good finance team in place, and the CFO obviously is a part of that, then you should have processes and controls that actually take that overhead away, because they systematize the way we do things, right? And by doing that, you actually allow founders to get on with the stuff that they're really great at, right? And a lot of the teams that we work with are typically going to be product-led founders or commercial founders, right? Like, so they want to be building, or they want to be selling. They don't actually want to be sat there looking at the numbers or doing the numbers, right? But they do want to understand what the numbers are telling them and where they need to go from there. So I appreciate that wasn't necessarily a direct answer to your question, because it will always depend from company to company. But the great thing about most CFOs who are actually competent CFOs is they are of a certain age. They have been through certain processes and stages of company growth, and therefore they understand how to slot themselves into a company that has already built some sort of a culture around them, and understand how to navigate that. And I think that's the great thing about really good CFOs, is that they will figure that out very quickly.
Yeah, and also I definitely love your answer, direct or no, but I think it was great, because then it's about showing all of the benefit that a CFO does, but also highlighting the mindset shift that needs to happen as at the founder level, but also at the organization level, to increase its maturity, to actually go towards the goal that they are going for. Now, one of the things you've mentioned again in your introduction, when you arrive, whether it's yourself or one of your team at Emerge One, you land into a company. What are some of the common challenges that you see a lot that make you cringe when you get to a startup?
Oh dear. I mean, that's
where do you start?
where to start? So the first and most critical, when I talked about it earlier, is just that basic hygiene layer. And often what I see is a founder who is doing their own books, but they don't actually understand how double entry bookkeeping works, and when something should be processed as an invoice or a bill, or what sort of what you should be using to build out your numbers. So the first thing, which is often most challenging, is just getting to the bottom of what those numbers are and making sure they are being reported correctly rather. So that is the first and almost the most common challenge we see. The second thing is often where a junior person has been hired in as a CFO, but essentially don't really know what they're doing, and that leaves the gaps. And it's often one of the reasons we get brought in. And a great example of that is, I came into a business that had raised a relatively decent amount of capital, but the CFO, who was not really a CFO, he was actually a lawyer by training, had neglected to include a substantial liability that was due to HMRC or whoever it was at the time, and that meant that the company had 6 months less runway than they actually expected themselves to have. Right, so not understanding very, very clearly how much runway you have and what room you have to play with, I think, is a second major thing. The third thing I think that is common is just a lack of basic process, right? And again, things are done in a very ad hoc way in very early stage business, and that's really normal. But a friend of mine, Jelaine Chan, who's an incredible kind of COO, she said to me, processes are what enable people to scale, right? If you have a company that has no process, then essentially people don't know what boundaries they're meant to work in, and that can be actually quite challenging for most people, right? Because most people, whether they're working for a startup or a more established company, they need the guidelines and the guardrails to understand what their role is and how to do it. And so, when we come into businesses, often it's about, okay, do you have an expense policy in place? No, right, let's get that sorted, right? What date do we expect payroll to go out? Let's make sure that's happening at the same time every month. Do we have, a plan around when we should be hiring people and what the process is for that? And how do we think about compensation package? Let's put in a process for that. So often a lot of it is kind of just building in that basic hygiene, as I say, of processes. Look, in the worst case scenarios, it is, we'll come into a business and we've got 4 months of runway. We're looking to fundraise right now. Can you introduce us to a bunch of people? And the first thing it'll be like, hey guys, you don't have the metrics, you don't have the runway, and you are essentially going out to fundraise in a market that is not going to close around in 2 or 3 months. So you've got to figure out other ways of raising capital pretty quickly. So I think there is no single answer. There are ultimately, for every business, different challenges in different ways. A lot of businesses we come into don't understand where their sales are coming from or how their salespeople are operating, if at all. We see a lot of models that essentially say, well, we'll just hire 3 salespeople and they'll bring in, whatever X deals a month at Y value. And you're like, well, no, you need to build that pipeline out and understand it. So really it's about getting to that fundamental understanding of how your business operates. And that's what a great CFO hopefully comes into your business and helps you do from day one. Because if you don't have a business model, you don't have a business. And if you don't have a business, good luck to you.
Yeah. And I think for me, the aspects of processes being the first thing that you put in place when you go into a business before you kind of start thinking about, okay, how do we shoot up from there, is super important. And I always love it when people talk about processes. It's something that I found as well, whether we're talking about the operation or the technical stage of things. sometimes I believe, startup scale-ups, there is this need of moving fast for obvious reasons, but what drops off is processes. Yet without the basic processes, of course, when I help a company, whether it's by looking at the processes for building their platforms or even communication and teams, it's usually like, do we have the time to do that? I'm like, yes, we kind of need to find the time to do that if you want to go forward, because if we don't, then what happens is that nobody knows what other people are doing, and then you wonder why you have so much stress. But so one thing I'm curious is, how do you get people to slow down? Although we both know we need to take that time, or especially you or your team needs to take that time to look at the books, look at what is done, ask the question, to really have this background information to know how to have them go forward, whilst at the same time you have the noise that says, please just let's keep going, let's go forward.
Look, I mean, startups, scale-ups, they're about moving fast. Like, ultimately, we don't act as a blocker to that kind of movement. Great CFOs are able to pass that information really quickly. Like, I can go into a business, look at the P&L and balance sheet, and pretty much get a decent enough idea of where the business is and where it's going, to start having, pretty interesting and in-depth conversations with the founders or the leadership team as to what should happen next, right? So again, CFOs, really great CFOs, have seen enough that they're able to walk into these businesses and get to grips with them pretty quickly. So often that isn't the problem. The problem is, what do you do when you see a business that actually isn't going in the right direction, right? So we come in, things seem okay, but actually we get into the numbers and we're like, oh, okay, hold on, maybe you're like looking at your revenue the wrong way and you're reporting your gross margin incorrectly, and actually things aren't quite as good as they looked, and you got some stuff on the balance sheet that's a little bit concerning, and oh, by the way, this convertible note that you raise is going to convert, but there's some all of that sort of stuff. The question then is, how do you prioritize, right? So as with anything, right, if you are prioritizing everything, you're prioritizing nothing. So a really good CFO, fractional or otherwise, will come in and they'll just identify what are the key things that we need to look at today. So, to give you the example of a business that I've been working with, the first priority was build out the financial model, so they're sitting on a decent amount of capital. There's no issues around runway, but it's like, okay, what are we actually going to do with that money? How are we going to spend it? Where is it best, utilized? So let's get that model done, right? And that can be quite an intense period of just doing the model, and that's iterating to and fro and doing multiple turns on the model and ensuring you've got it into the right place. And then thereafter, it might be, okay, well, we need to have an EMI scheme now put in place. Okay, let's get that workflow going. And a lot of these things will be happening obviously in parallel. So it's not necessarily that you work on one and then, move to the other. You may be working on kind of two simultaneously, but where your predominant focus sits is probably going to be one rather than the other. And to answer your question, I guess more directly, again, as I said, we're not there to have, like, a lot of people have this assumption that CFOs are there to, say no, right? Like, it's that,
yes.
it's that kind of parody of a very gray suited and booted accountant that is basically shaking their heads and saying, no, we can't spend, no, we can't spend. Tech CFOs, right? So people like me and people like those that work with me, we understand that you got to spend money in a startup to make money, right? So not in the sense that, okay, we're going to throw money at everything that comes our way, but it's about understanding how to balance the risks and trade-offs and the opportunity costs, right? So unfortunately, I've seen in a lot of early stage businesses, again, lots of experimentation, lots of, well, if we do this pilot over here and this project over here and that project over there, we'll end up doing something. And kind of the first thing I'll say, to a founder in that sort of situation is, like, hold on a second. Yes, there are these 20 projects or pilots that you could look at, but which one is going to give us most bang for our buck immediately? So why don't we focus all of our energy and our scarce resources? Because ultimately we have scarce resources, right? We're not generating positive cash flow. We don't have unlimited funds in the bank. We may have 1 million or 2 million. Like, how do we ensure that we are using that money in the best way possible to take the business forward? So it's, again, as I say, it's about prioritizing so that you can enable growth rather than stalling it.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things that comes out a lot whenever I talk to startups about growth and CFO and finances. Not that I advise them, but just cover the topics of when they should start looking into that. Is this, yeah, as you mentioned, this assumption of a showstopper rather than seeing that as an enabler, and actually to help you focus, as you've mentioned. Resources are limited, time is limited, and we need to see results quite fast. So where should we go? Now, my next question, I want to spend some time to dive into Aarish Shah, really, because as I've said before, I absolutely love your experience, and I do have the opportunity to ask some questions about your background, which I believe will also be quite inspirational to other founders out there. But before I get to that, a quick reminder to our audience that we are already taking people that have already signed up to the mentoring session that we have, the tech product mentoring session that we have at the end of the month. So if you have any questions on your startups, not sure exactly what's going on, or want to kind of have someone to speak to and dive into it, then do sign up, as spots are limited. Now, as I was researching you, Aarish, I find out, quite breadth of knowledge, which is amazing. But also, you've done very different things, and I wanted to find out a little bit, how did you manage to transition and the learning between the transitions? Because of course, you worked in consultancies, in the family business, into the fractional CFO, and now even running your own startups. So what have you learned along the journey, taking on from the positive and negatives of one and bringing on to the next?
Wow. Yeah, that's that's a pretty broad question. I mean, look, I guess by background, for those that don't know me, I was actually a linguist. So I graduated university 20 something years ago with a degree in languages, which I realized were kind of useful, but not essential. So I ended up working with kind of PricewaterhouseCoopers, their business process outsourcing unit, on their Nortel Networks contract, then with Nortel Networks directly, and then into Deutsche Bank. And that was kind of the very early part of my career, which was probably the most formative in terms of how I've ended up where I am now, certainly from a numbers perspective, because during that time I qualified as a chartered management accountant. But I've never actually been an accountant. What I was very good at was understanding how to streamline processes, build spreadsheets quickly, automate them, build macros, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, I taught myself kind of the basics of Excel, how to do a VLOOKUP in my first job, and then, quickly kind of built on that knowledge and started writing macros and recording macros and so on. And I guess that's sat at the core of everything I've probably done since. Not like the VLOOKUPs, obviously I use them a lot, but that just approach to learning. And look, I mean, I think the one thing that, for those that don't know me, I am a massive generalist, and I have a huge love of learning. So I'm interested in lots and lots of different things at different times for different reasons. And I try and broaden my knowledge as much as possible. And look, in today's environment, with, the genesis of generative AI, of ChatGPT, of OpenAI's, sources of Lambda, and all the rest of the models that are out there, and like, quite frankly, the very quick pace of change that we're going to see in the market and in careers over the next 3, 5, 10 years. If you aren't able to learn, you will be left behind. And I don't mean learn necessarily about AI, but a core aspect of anything that you do is going to be, how do you keep abreast of the new skills that are going to be coming out there. And then look, I left the UK back in 2006, and I went out to Papua New Guinea, where, as you say, I worked for my family's business. Now, that was an MBA by experience. So I spent 10 years running a group of manufacturing and trading businesses alongside a property portfolio. And look, let me tell you this: if you can figure out how to manage cash flow in a manufacturing business in an emerging economy, in the middle of nowhere, where it takes 3 months to get raw materials shipped over to you, where you're paying your suppliers at site, like on in advance, essentially. It takes 3 months to get to you, 2 months to clear off the docks, another month and a half to 2 months to convert into saleable product, and then then you got to sell it, and then you got to collect the cash. And by the way, when I say collect cash, I really do mean collect cash, or you'd have to head into kind of the Highlands on a 7-hour drive to collect a check from a small trader up there. Like, if you can figure out how that works, you're going to be pretty sensible when it comes to a SaaS business. It's not too hard. So
it's like you went into jungle warfare in terms of learning to then go back into the SaaS model and everything that's happening these days.
Both figuratively and literally. I've had people come into the office with guns, as I've told many people.
Wow.
I had one of my factories burnt to the ground. But yeah, look, I mean, a huge amount of learning, a huge amount of understanding of how business operates and works, understanding how to hire people, how to fire people, sadly, as well. And also, at various times I was the acting CFO, I was the acting COO, I was the acting pretty much everything, because again, it's an environment where finding talent can be very difficult. You have to bring it in from overseas, often from India or Australia or the Philippines or Sri Lanka or China, for that matter, or Malaysia. So you're wearing lots of hats, you're doing lots of roles, and you have to get deep into your business, right? And it was my business, as it were. And I think the biggest lesson that I actually learned there was, which I only learned after the fact, I guess, is how to extract your ego from the business. I think, lots of founders get very emotionally tied to their business, and that's kind of understandable, right? But the reality is that most founders are going to go through a period where they're not sure how they're going to make payroll. They're not sure whether that next sale is going to come. They're not sure if they are going to raise their next round. They're not sure if the business has legs. They're not sure if they're going to be able to move forward. And if your ego is entirely wrapped up in your business, that can be absolutely devastating, right? Like, I remember sleepless nights where I was like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make payroll. I don't know how I'm going to pay. And these are 100, 200 people that I was responsible for, who are living already kind of at the breadline anyway, because we're talking about manual laborers here. Whatever we did, whether we were providing them benefits or not, or giving them above the sort of average pay scale, like, if we couldn't make payroll, that was a big deal, right? So that was, it was a massively humbling lesson to learn that A, you can't control everything, B, that you are not your business. I talk about that a lot, right? Like, you have to extract your ego from your business, and that's the only way you can stay sort of sane. And when I left New Guinea and came back to the UK, I really honestly didn't know what I was going to do. So ended up having a bunch of coffees and found myself returning to that kind of finance, accounting kind of anchor that I had. And ended up as founding CFO in an edtech venture, which was a joint venture between Eton College and Founders Factory. And again, so I found myself within 3 months of returning to the UK, literally kind of, starting from scratch. I'd left my family business. I kind of completely moved out of it. Found myself 10 foot away from Brent Hoberman. So here I am, this sort of, I don't know how old I would have been, like 36, 37. Essentially kind of middle-aged, starting to work in startups with Brent Hoberman sat there. We had Henry Lane Fox on our board, Jim Miley, we had, the bursar of Eton College and various others. So it was an immensely, interesting experience. We were operating out in China. I was doing some of the biz dev out there. We, was responsible for the finance and ops over there, and some of the and the finance in the UK, certainly. And, just understanding what it meant to be in a startup, and having been, having come from this entrepreneurial background as I did, and having this love for kind of very early stage, exciting businesses that are just starting to explore, on the limits of what's possible, I really understood that this was kind of where I wanted to be. And, one of my core kind of purposes at a personal level is to help. Right. So it's to help. And in terms of kind of my business philosophy, is to help founders and their businesses grow, right, and to scale. And going back to what I said earlier about being this massive generalist, I realized that actually I didn't like doing the same thing over and over again. And I said, well, okay, how do I actually explore and expand out of just doing a job, and sort of set myself up as a fractional CFO at that time.
Sorry to interrupt there, because there's a couple of things I wanted to bring up. One, on the generalist side, which it's very interesting, because you've mentioned that a couple of times, and I think it would be nice to pause here, because there's a lot of people that, whether they're thinking about taking on different roles, or whether they're wondering whether they should join startups or not, they're worried about maybe not being a specialist enough, and being a generalist sometimes can be seen as a negative. And of course, from your experience, your story, and from what you bring to startups, there's a lot of value based on, the entire your journey and your background that you're bringing in companies. As I'm also a generalist, I started in tech as a software engineer actually, and then I got lost in the world of leadership because no one wanted to do that, and we just needed someone to tell people this is how we're going to deliver this massive digital transformation in the company for us, not even thinking about the clients. And that's how I move forward to the world of scale-ups, when I thought I love doing different things. So how do I bring that knowledge together? Because in a scale-up or in a startup, it's not so much about who should do what. Of course, yes, you need some level of that. But if something is on fire, if we have to jump in, you have to jump in. So what kind of advice do you give to especially founders or even early stage members of a startup, which they feel a little bit uncomfortable about not being specialists, or even uncomfortable hiring generalists?
So at the very early stages of a startup, right? So if you're 0 to 5 employees, let's say 0 to 10 employees, like certainly 0 to 5, everyone's going to be a generalist. Like there is very limited value in bringing on a specialist at that stage. Yes, okay, maybe an engineer, but even that engineer needs to think in general terms, right? They need to be able to understand what the business flow is going to be. They can't just be a straight up coder, because, you know, that isn't going to add the value necessarily. They need to understand the whole sort of thesis of the business to actually build the product that is necessary. So what I typically say is, like, at early stage and for founders, you have to, well, especially as a founder, you have to be a generalist, right? You need to be able to do sales. You need to be able to do product. You need to be able to do operations. You need to be able to do finance to some extent. You need to be able to go and talk to investors and fundraise. Like you have to wear all of those hats, right? Because you're not going to be able to hire 10 people to do those various roles. And also there aren't 10 roles to hire for, because there, as I said very early on in our conversation, you know, at the earlier stages, there are fragmented roles, right? So the fractional CFO being one of them, but you might even have fractional CPOs, right? Fractional product leads, or fractional, biz dev leads, right? Because there just isn't that long full-time requirement. So at the very early stages, you are better off hiring generalists in any case. And look, I mean, my thesis is the way the world is moving, everyone will need to be a generalist. Like the need for T-shaped and W-shaped people is and M-shaped people, if people understand. So the W is obviously you go deep into several areas, but you're broad across many. Like I think that will become more and more prevalent, because as technology changes, like we are just going to need to be adept at marketing, at sales, at finance, at everything, right? Because your job and your career is going to move in various directions. So at the very early stages, absolutely generalists are kind of critical. As you move on, as you scale in a business, obviously you're going to hire more and more specialists for specific projects and needs, right? So you may need someone who is very specifically a front-end dev. You may need someone who's a data scientist, right? You may need someone who's a head of growth. You may need someone who is only focused on marketing, like for sure. But you will always have generalists in your organization. The COO is a great example of a generalist. The CFO and the COO are often conflatable titles. Often, a lot of our CFOs will play the role of a quasi COO as much as a CFO. Because generalists are typically going to be the people that string the strategy together, right? So, you've got to have a map to understand the terrain, but the map is not the terrain, right? So generalists are very good at taking disparate pieces of information and stringing them together and understanding how they coalesce into, essentially a business, right? Because that's what we're talking about, right? So, how do I take this product that this engineer has built and match that to this sales lead so that he can talk to that enterprise customer and then ensure that we're getting paid so that we can fund all of this stuff happening? That requires a generalist thinking, right? Like you can't be siloed in that thought process. So, I mean, I think we're going to see more and more generalists as the world continues to evolve. And I definitely don't think people should be scared of hiring generalists. I think hiring specialists too early is actually a killer for the business. You need people that can sit across the breadth of the whole business. Yeah.
And yes, if you can kill one bird with more than one stone, then why not just go for that? And I guess the other thing I also wanted to mention, again, is your experience. You talked a lot about the learning process that you have to have. not just now, obviously the technology, everything is changing, but the mindset of a founder and individual is to growth. This is something that I've seen a lot, just from not myself, but also the people I've interviewed on my podcast. There's been a lot of quite great entrepreneur like Hélène Guillaume in fintech. We had Charlotte Crossgrove, who now do in fintech, but she's starting in technology and all of that. But one of the things I see a lot is this idea of also not just learning in the same country, but also traveling and exploring other countries, right? So I wanted to learn Spanish, and I wanted to start my own business. And I thought, I want both. So I decided to live half in Spain, half in the UK, so that I can have the breadth of doing the two. And now I want to learn philosophy. I don't know why. I just woke up and I really wanted to learn a bit more about philosophy and psychology. And now I'm doing that one night a week. So, but the question that people always ask me is, how do you find the time to fit everything? And I wanted to ask you that question as well, because in addition to pretty much everything that you do, I mean, with the startup, the scale up, and the networking and everything, you also have a couple of podcasts that you run. And I've seen that, I don't know whether it's poetry that you run as well. So how do you manage everything?
Yeah. So the short answer is I don't. But look, first I would just touch on a couple of things. So yeah, look, travel massively. I think broadening horizons is critical. I mean, I spent a lot of my early life traveling around. I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time in Africa and in the USA, in Europe, and Southeast Asia, and then obviously lived in Papua New Guinea and Australia, and then back in the UK. My wife is Italian, so that ability to meet, understand, and synthesize other cultures and understand is massively important. By the way, when you think in another language, your thinking changes. I think that's the other really incredible thing. Like, I mean, I think there is, and the way language is constructed, by the way, also helps with the way you're thinking. So, the reason that there tends to be outsized performance in mathematics in China, as an example, is because the numerical system, the way you talk about numbers, makes it very easy to understand how numbers go together, right? So there isn't a number 11, there is a number that is 10 1, right? Like that's how it works. So when you're saying 111, you would say 100 10 1, right? So you basically are already breaking it down into its components. Anyway, so that's a side note. And by the way, philosophy also an incredible thing to be studying right now, especially with generative AI. I mean, a lot of the prompt engineers out there coming from those sort of philosophy and what used to be called soft backgrounds, right? Actually massively useful. I've had a thesis for a long time that the creatives will own the world, right? Everything else will be automated away. But look, to answer your question about how do I find the time, it's prioritization, right? And what I realized also when I was, because I had Emerge One, I was running that as a business, and then I started building Projected, which I raised some capital for a couple of years ago, and sadly ran out of money a couple of months ago in that business, although I'll continue to bootstrap it. It is about prioritizing your time and understanding what is important, what is relevant. So you said, as an example, I also write poetry. Yeah, but I haven't written poetry for probably about 5-6 years. As in, I still kind of do in my head, but not in the way that I was doing, 5-10 years ago. I used to do a lot of photography. Equally, I've stopped sort of doing that. And why? Because I just don't have the time, right? So I focus on what are the things that drive me forward, what are the things that give me most energy, and what are the things that I think are going to add outsized value to my life over time. So one is my business, because that is how I pay the bills and how I maintain my lifestyle. But equally, the way I've been able to structure my life, because I run my own business and because I am a fractional CFO when I do CFO work, it means that I have the ability to control my time, right? And what that means is I can spend an hour, I was late coming onto this podcast, as slightly because I was recording with a previous guest for Nothing Ventured, and that ran over slightly. But I'm able to carve out 2 hours in my day to do a couple of podcasts and not have to worry about, what am I going to have to do to catch up? Because I've planned how what I need to do for the entire week. Second thing, by the way, is, this is very prosaic. I have an incredible EA, right? Like, so Rose, who is based out of the Philippines, she manages my diary and much more. without her, I'd very much be lost, because I could not manage my diary if I tried. Because 90% of my time is spent on calls, on conversations, and ensuring that I have enough time to set aside for those sort of things is critical. But what it comes down to, as I say, is what do you prioritize? What is important? What are the things that are most important to you, and to your goals and objectives in life? And for me, today, really where most of my focus is with Emerge One, with the business, and aligned with that is the podcast. And then I basically find time for other things when I have the time to find. So, whether that's trying to learn how to write Python, which I've been kind of doing on and off for the last 3 years, whether that is playing around with Auto GPT and trying to figure out whether it can turn itself into an investment advisor. Right now, it doesn't seem to have been able to. I'll cut out the half an hour or whatever if I think it's important enough. But it really just comes down to prioritization and understanding what things are important, why they're important.
Yeah, I definitely agree when it comes to not just prioritization, but understanding why something is important to you. Because I believe that a lot of people drift, whether you're in business or not, you drift because you don't know what your priorities are and why they're important to you. And for me, having that at the core helps me to have that sense of being fully fulfilled, because I don't want my life to be just about work, and also don't want my life to be about the things that I didn't go for because I was too scared of doing it, or because I was just too distracted by other things. But it's been such a great conversation, and I'm mindful of time because I'm sure I've got still plenty of questions that many people have. And thank you so much, Aarish, for coming on the show. We've covered a lot about finance, CFO, what it means, what the amazing help you bring to companies, and why, and what startup needs to think about, even if they don't have one on board. And if you need someone to chat to, well, you know where Emerge One is. So if you have one final advice for our startups before we go, what would be your parting advice for this episode?
Really the same advice that any founder should take on board day one. Don't build what you want to build something that is needed. So go out, figure out what people want before you start building, because from my own experience, you can waste a lot of time doing it the other way around. But look, the other, and I think, the other thing is, be true to yourself, understand, your limitations, but also your aspirations. Chase your dreams for sure, but be realistic, and avoid sunk cost mentality, right? Just because you've put money into something doesn't mean that, you shouldn't stop doing it if it just isn't working out. And I see too many founders that continue to pursue an idea despite everything else, because they think, well, I've already, put 10 years or 5 years or 2 years or and 100 grand into it, I should just keep going. Well, no, actually, because startup world is all about experimentation. It's all about figuring out how to move from one thing to the next quickly by learning and iterating, and essentially understanding when something isn't working is probably one of the hardest life skills to learn. I appreciate that was, again, more than one piece of advice. But as you can probably tell, I tend to have more than one thought on multiple topics.
Well, when someone is a bit like, I feel a bit like I was holding a box of chocolate. I'm never going to get just the one. And you always, share so many great insight and advice. So I'm just going to, lap it up. Thanks, Aarish, for coming on the show, and thanks for the audience. If you want to find out more about Aarish, we have a description on the bottom of our show notes. But I will also highly encourage that to check out Nothing Ventured podcast. Well, it's such an amazing podcast. Even if you're not in the VC world, I've learned a lot, actually, just following your podcast, Aarish. And also of balance is something that's very short, quick, and you can pick that up on the go. But I will also advise that you check out Emerge One. They're doing an amazing job. If you are fundraising now, you're thinking about scaling, and especially if you've already got your Series A, don't just wait. Go and have a chat with them, and I'm sure they will sort you out. And for everybody else, do remember that we do have our mentoring session at the end of the month. We focus mostly on the tech, products, and of course the mindset and operation side of things. So if you have any questions, you feel a bit stuck and you want to speak to me or other people from the team and other mentors that join us, do sign up. In the meantime, let's design a happy and productive workplace playground together.